All right, everybody, welcome back. My name is Rory Truex. For those of you who don't know me and who weren't here last week, I'm an associate professor in the Department of Politics at Princeton University in the School of Public and International Affairs. And this initiative is in my capacity as a citizen. This is not something that's sponsored by Princeton. It's independent of Princeton, but I'm a scholar of authoritarian politics. And the goal in creating this forum was to create a space for people to sit back and reflect about the broader issues facing American democracy today, thinking about the broader theme of democratic erosion. Another key ethos we're trying to ascribe to is that this is not a Democrat or a Republican space. This is not necessarily a partisan space. It's a pro-democracy space. And so we hope to have a big tent and attract people and include people from different ideological parts of the ideological spectrum, but that fundamentally believe in democracy. So today is a very exciting day. This is our first outside speaker, and I'm so honored to be able to introduce Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor. Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor is a colleague and a friend of mine. She's a professor in the Department of African American Studies at Princeton and a leading scholar on Black politics, social movements, and racial inequality in the United States. She has too many books to name here, lest we take up too much time, but I would just highlight a few. Her book, Race for Profit, How Banks and the Real Estate Industry Undermined Black Homeownership, was a semi-finalist for the 2019 National Book Award and a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. She's also won the MacArthur Foundation Fellowship in 2021. She's the co-founder of Hammer and Hope, which is we've linked that magazine here in the bottom under the calls to action. Hammer and Hope is a new magazine, online magazine about Black political thought and Black culture. She's also a contributing writer at The New Yorker and a former contributing writer for the New York Times. In 2016, she was named one of the 100 most influential African Americans in the United States by The Root. So please join me in welcoming Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor. Hi, Keeanga, how are you?
Hey, I'm great, Rory. How are you?
I'm doing all right. Thank you for coming on a summer afternoon. You have much better things to do, but you're here on a webinar on a hot Thursday, so we appreciate your time. For those of you who are new to the forum, the format is it's going to feel a little bit more academic and less like a talk show. We've invited Keeanga to speak for about 10 to 15 minutes on the broader themes of race, Black history, and the MAGA movement. And I think she's going to give us some historical context. And then I will plan on interviewing her for about 10 to 15 minutes, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. So without further ado, Keeanga, please feel free to make your opening remarks.
Thank you. And I hope to bring some talk show vibes through provocation. So I have some prepared remarks to make sure I sort of make the points I want to make clearly, and they're probably too long, so I'll cut myself off around 10 minutes or so, and then we can just get into it. Last May, so a couple of months ago, 5 days after the 5-year anniversary of the murder of George Floyd, Donald Trump nominated Paul Ingrassia to direct the Office of Special Counsel. This small office is responsible for protecting whistleblowers and investigating wrongdoing in the office of the presidency. Under ordinary circumstances, Ingrassia's appointment would be odd. He is 30 years old, having graduated law school just 2 years ago, has no particular legal experience, qualifying him as appropriate to lead an office specifically dedicated to monitoring compliance with the law and public policy. And in the span of his brief career, Ingrassia is much more known for his bigotry than his actual grasp of the law. Espousing the racist dogma of conspiracy theories of immigration, Ingrassia posted on the social media platform X last summer, quote, "God forbid we ever enact policies to protect the native population whites, whose birth rates are far below replacement levels." In an earlier post, he wrote, quote, "Biden's open borders are destroying our great American women, and that is by design. Replace every last American with a terrorist infiltrator or gang member from the third world." In December of 2023, he wrote, quote, "Exceptional white men are not only the builders of Western civilization, but are the ones most capable of appreciating the fruits of our heritage, and are conversely hurt the most at a spiritual level by its destruction." Ingrassia also appears to harbor a high tolerance for anti-Semitism. He was part of Manosphere Brute, Andrew Tate's legal team, assembled to defend him against charges of human trafficking. But Tate is also known as a Holocaust denier and a defender of Nazis, at one point proclaiming, quote, "We should bring back the Nazi salute," before performing it on the X platform. He also made pleas for the return of Nazi sympathizers Kanye West and Nick Fuentes to the platform of X after their removal for anti-Semitic content. Earlier this spring, a woman by the name of Kingsley Wilson was appointed as a deputy press secretary at the Department of Defense. Wilson, who is 26, before her appointment, bizarrely attacked the legacy of Leo Frank. Leo Frank was a young Jewish man who was lynched by an anti-Semitic mob in Georgia in 1915 after being falsely accused of raping a white girl. Frank was believed to be innocent, but was given a full pardon by the governor of Georgia several years ago. But the assumption of guilt has been a cause célèbre among white supremacists. Wilson wrote on X again in 2023, Leo Frank raped and murdered a 13-year-old girl. He also tried to frame a Black man for his crime. Rachel Cawley is the communications director for the White House of Office Management and Budget. But before that post, she served on the board of Patriot Freedom, a January 6th defense committee. In 2022, she attended the trial of Timothy Hale Cuccinelli as a sympathizer for him. Hale Cuccinelli gained infamy in appearing at his job at a naval weapons station, donning a Hitler-esque mustache and telling his coworkers that Hitler should have finished the job. And in the year 2020, he compared Orthodox Jews to a, quote, plague of locusts. Not only did Cawley sit among his supporters, but Hale Cuccinelli himself has twice appeared at a Donald Trump golf club where he has delivered speeches at fundraising events hosted by the club. Finally, there is Darren Beattie, who was fired in the first Trump administration for attending a white nationalist rally, only to be invited to return in Trump 2.0. Beattie once complained on X that, quote, competent white men must be in charge if you want things to work. Unfortunately, our entire national ideology is predicated on coddling the feelings of women and minorities and demoralizing competent white men. As recently as this week, the US Department of Defense signed off on a contract that will pay Elon Musk's company, xAI, $200 million to use a Grok artificial intelligence bot days after the Grok chatbot compared itself to Hitler and espoused anti-Semitic and racist conspiracy theories. The Trump administration has certainly attacked universities and college students for much less. And this is just scratching the surface. There are countless other examples, not just of white nationalists being recruited into the Trump administration, but the presidency itself being an incubator and vector for these ideas, policies, and practices. To describe this as mere hypocrisy is to almost impute some legitimacy to the antics of the administration, or to view the contradictions as a mistake or mishap. But the absurdity of anti-Semites campaigning against anti-Semitism, or white nationalists campaigning against discrimination, is at least part of the point. The point being to mock the political process and the political agencies themselves. It is mockery of the role of government and the assumptions that public policy is intended to uphold and protect the public's welfare. The point of mockery and farce is to further degrade and undermine the public's trust in the function of these institutions, so that even if the Trumpers were ever to leave office, these offices and their services will have been so degraded and incapacitated that they will be difficult to revive. It fits into the longer historical ambitions of conservatives as articulated through the politics of the Heritage Foundation, which was founded in 1973. And that is a political framework that denies any role for government or the use of public policy in combating racial inequality, or programs believed to impede the function of markets, including programs that may assist Black and Brown people overcoming the historical impediments or obstacles to their social mobility, especially affirmative action. That has been the political profile of conservative politics for more than 50 years as a response to the civil rights movement. The Trump administration is not just the continuation of those politics, but it is adding its own flourishes. The main flourish being to jettison the commitment to colorblindness as the political framework for denying the role of the state in overcoming inequality. The Trump administration is operating from a position of color consciousness, mainly in describing their ambitions as in service to white Americans, traditional Americans. This is, of course, what is at the heart of what it means to make America great again. During the campaign, Trump complained of anti-white racism as a source of his desire to run and to right these wrongs. He described himself as a victim of anti-white racism, dismissing the legal efforts of Georgia and the state of New York as racism against him. The explicit attacks on diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives and programs is hinged on the assumption that they represent anti-white racism. In a 2024 interview with Time magazine, Trump said, quote, "I think there is a definite anti-white feeling in this country, and that can't be allowed. But I think the laws are very unfair right now, and education is being very unfair, and it's being stifled. But I don't think it's going to be a big problem at all. But if you look at it right now, there's absolutely a bias against white people that is a problem." An understated impetus for the investigation into colleges and universities has been what the Trump administration describes as anti-white bias. In a 6-page document outlining charges against Harvard University, the Trump Department of Education claimed that Harvard's share of tenured white male faculty dropped from 64% to 56% from 2013 to 2023, and that it was evidence, quote, of an underlying pattern or practice of discrimination based on race and sex, and thus, quote, there is reason to believe discrimination is continuing. Ironically, even as the Trump administration deployed an executive order demanding an end to the use of, quote, disparate impact measures because of a, quote, near insurmountable presumption of unlawful discrimination exists where there are any differences in outcomes in certain circumstances among different races, sexes, or similar groups, even if there is no facially discriminatory policy or practice or discriminatory intent, close quote. They used the same method to determine that a slight decrease in the number of white men on the faculty at Harvard over a 10-year period amounts to racial discrimination, more mockery and farce. Where traditionally the right has trained its focus on poor Black people as scapegoats and targets for dismantling the welfare state, on the presumption that these are poor people looking to get something for nothing, logic that was deployed again to explain away the attacks on Medicaid and food stamps most recently, to very little success, it should be stated. But the attacks on colleges and universities, DEI program, and the private sector as well, are focused on middle class and upwardly mobile Black Americans, as if to round out the narrative that their mobility or success has come at the expense of white men. This has especially been the case in the Department of Defense, where Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth has removed Black officers and other high-ranking officials, claimed that they were only in those positions because they are Black, and then replaced them with white men. More generally, the downward mobility of ordinary working-class white men, evidenced through what some social scientists have described as death by despair and general insecurity, is being explained away as the result of DEI and affirmative action. It is rationalized through an assumption based on cultural cues that blacks are in and whites are out. These cultural assumptions were in full tilt in the response of corporate America to the 2020 protest and uprising, where the COVID crisis had exposed the inequality of American capitalism as people misidentified as, quote, essential workers who were disproportionately Black and brown were forced to work outside the home, placing their lives in peril. But millions of white working people also faced uncertainty as mass layoffs ensued and threats of eviction and foreclosure took hold. The COVID crisis highlighted the deep financial insecurity and inequality of American society in general. But the Floyd uprisings and ensuing protests created an opportunity for corporate America to change the topic from one of inequality to a very narrow conception of racism. Of course, the predominant slogan of the demonstrations was Black Lives Matter. But by 2020, nearly 7 years into the Black Lives Matter movement, this extended far beyond the issue of police brutality to take up questions of employment, to take up questions of public health, to take up questions about housing in particular. But the messaging that overwhelmed the politics of 2020 was one narrowly focused on changing the behavior and attitudes to respond to an ill-defined, quote unquote, systemic racism. Take, for example, the dramatic gesture of billionaire financier Larry Fink, the CEO of the BlackRock equity firm, who wrote in an open letter days after the murder of Floyd, quote, "I am appalled, as is anyone who cares about diversity, fairness, and justice, by the events in the last few weeks involving racial injustice in the US." He continued, "As a firm committed to racial equality, we must also consider where racial disparity exists in our own organizations and not tolerate our shortcomings. We can only heal these wounds, building a more diverse and inclusive firm and contributing to a more just society, if we talk to each other and cultivate honest, open relationships and friendships." So essentially reducing the issue of racism to one of misunderstanding that can be overcome through talking, relationships, and friendships. Between May 2020 and October 2022, nearly 1,400 American corporations pledged nearly $400 billion to address racial inequality in the country. But only a fraction of that money was dedicated to addressing police brutality, with only 8 companies making donations to Black Lives Matter type organizations. Mostly the pledges were for investments in housing and other kinds of business ventures intended as a bridge to greater Black participation in the economy. 90% of those promises came from the financial sector. The promises of investments were coupled with high-profile and heavily publicized apologies or dramatic self-flagellation from the National Football League, decrying the quote-unquote systematic oppression of Black people, as it apologized for punishing players who had participated in nonviolent protests, or the National Association of Realtors trading in the use of, quote, master bedroom for primary suite, or NASCAR decrying its use of the Confederate flag. Aunt Jemima pancake mix was retired. Uncle Ben was liberated from the rice fields as the Mars Company changed the name of Uncle Ben's Rice to simply Ben's Rice. Not only were these insufficient to actually addressing racial discrimination, but they created a perception that corporate America and government itself would only respond to one kind of oppression at a time when millions of white people were also suffering from political and economic crisis. It could easily feed a perception amplified by Trump that the attention paid to DEI was coming to the detriment of other kinds of aid, that the state was willing to bend over backwards to help Black people while doing nothing for the ordinary forgotten white man or Latino. Of course, none of that was true. Framing racism as personal and rooted in behavior took us away from critiques of capitalism to critiques of white people and their personal interactions with persons of color. To be sure, many of those interactions could be problematic, troubling, and indeed racist. But the conditions that have made young working class Black men and boys vulnerable to policing are not office microaggressions. The conditions that created the twin crises of greater rates of unemployment and COVID deaths, as experienced in Black communities in 2020, were not because of the perceived sensitivities of white women. That 40% of the unhoused population in the United States today are Black people, who only make up 13% of the population, is not because of an unwelcoming work environment that DEI is aimed at addressing. But the focus on these issues helped to perpetuate this impression that the state was going out of its way to lift up one group at the expense of the other. And so I'll end there just in terms of trying to understand what is different about the way that the Trump administration is utilizing racial grievance and animus in this period compared to other periods. This has been a theme in many ways throughout post-emancipation American history. But as most things with history, it is a theme that is marked by both continuity, but also change. And I will stop there.
Keeanga, thank you so much. So much here to talk about. I wanted to talk a little bit about your initial remarks about the different personalities and people that have made their way into the Trump administration. Last week in our session, we talked a little bit about this book from Levitsky and Ziblatt, which is about, I'm not showing it properly, Tyranny and the Minority, which is kind of their sequel to How Democracies Die. And in that book, they talk about what it means to be a democratic party. And by that, I mean democracy, pro-democracy party, not democratic with a large D.
Small d.
Small d. And the key, one of the key points they make is democratic parties, they forbid political violence. They distance themselves from political violence and from political extremists, even if they're on their side of the ideological aisle, so to speak. And so you talked a little bit about what is different this time around, the kind of flourish of going from color blindness to being very color conscious. Another thing I wanted you to weigh on a little bit was the sort of role of extremists making their way into the Trump administration, and the Republican Party itself going from being a conservative party that operated within the confines of democracy, honored the results of elections, for example, to what I would consider an authoritarian political party under Donald Trump, and the role that race has been the kind of vector through which extremists are identified and potentially even brought into this administration. I don't know if you share that position.
I think there are a couple of things. One is even looking at the contrast between the first Trump administration, which, you know, I think then it was clear that this was going to be a break from what we sort of typically think of as political norms. That was clear through the Trump's candidacy. And, you know, it seemed to be sort of embodied in Trump, and that part of his appeal to his voters was his kind of boorishness and rejection of political norms. But they were still sort of constrained by, I would say, broader political norms, so that in Trump's first term, this person, Warren Beatty, who goes to a white nationalist conference and is discovered there, is immediately fired. And you could see some hints of that in Trump 2.0 when Doge was first being set up and Comrade Big Balls was discovered to have written all of these, you know, racist comments on social media. He was initially dismissed. And then, you know, there's a sort of realization that we are trying to do things differently, and they walk that back. And so someone like Beatty, you know, who never deleted his comments that if you want things done right, that you have to have competent white men in charge, is invited back to the administration. The Doge staff member is invited back into the administration. And then now you just have, you know, Paul Ingrassia who has a very long social media history of just out and out racist comments. There's no effort to erase that. There's very little effort to contextualize that. The Trump administration denounces the criticisms of that and doubles down on its support for it. And I think part of this is that it was the extremists that were Trump's most vociferous defenders, whether through the threat of political and physical violence on January 6th, 2021, or just through populating the social media platforms over the 4-year period where he was out of office in vociferous defense of him. And so this administration has been one that is filled with his what they call Trump loyalists, and that happens to include white supremacists, white nationalists, anti-Semites. And I think that they are intending not just to transform the kind of material character of the state, right, through mass firings, shutting down offices, exerting the authority of the executive office above all others, but ideologically as well, which is a defense of white men being in charge, a defense of their kind of view of the world that anti-discrimination policies and practices are discriminatory against white people and give an unfair advantage to unqualified Black people, and that they are here to correct that problem. Some of that responds to longstanding ideological traditions within conservatism, which is about a kind of hostility towards uses of the state to expand the public good and to, use that to overcome market things that they believe interfere with the market. But some of those are ideological markers of the Trump administration per se. That is a reflection of the kind of white supremacist and white nationalist influence within the administration, starting with Stephen Miller.
So one of the ways we would interpret this in our field, like in authoritarian politics, we often talk about like a loyalty competence trade-off, and people who are trying to engage in democratic backsliding erosion, trying to grab power, obviously prioritize loyalty over all else. And we've seen a lot of fairly incompetent people enter into the Trump administration. Another wrinkle to that is, how do you foster loyalty? You identify people who are basically broken things, right? Who have no other options. They would be cast out in a normal society. Right. And so by identifying overt racists and having those type of people inhabit high-level places in the administration, that binds them all together. That's a glue that fosters loyalty. And it's almost, to hear you describe it now, it's almost like this attribute was deliberately selected on. This was sort of like something that would not be held against you, but would be actually held in your favor as a way, almost like an ideological purity test.
If one were to look back at the last year or year and a half, even outside of the Project 2025, which really articulates, 99% of what the Trump administration is carrying out. But they spoke openly of this. In some ways, they could do that because Congress was held by Republicans, or the House was held by Republicans throughout 2024, which is when they began to have these hearings, particularly of college administrators. But they started over the last year and a half saying that when they were going to return, that they were going to use executive orders, particularly to weed out anti-white bias. And that particular framework is one that has been sharply and clearly defined by white nationalists. It is a part of the politics of white supremacists in the United States. And so those have been the most vociferous, even beyond the Republican Party itself the most vociferous defenders of Trump. And, it's not just about being rewarded for the loyalty. It's about how do you maintain the integrity, the political integrity, really even the physical integrity of the administration, is by putting in people who are not just the kind of typical political grift of just favors and the typical way that politics run, but the people who have an ideological commitment to what they believe is a political struggle, not just a fight to keep this or that office, but a fight for a political vision for the future of the country.
One theme, I want to get to Q&A from the audience quickly, but I did want to ask you a little bit about this concept of patriotic education, which is, as a China scholar and someone who studies authoritarianism, this is something we see quite a lot in the authoritarian world. It carries different meanings in different places. This has been raised as a kind of antidote to critical race theory, and we saw 1776 Commission in response to the 1619 project coming out of the New York Times. And so can you talk to us a little bit about, especially as someone who's teaching critical race theory, I believe you told me your course is titled Critical Race Theory, is that correct? So can you tell us a little bit about how you view patriotic education? And one of the themes in this book, which I also wanted to highlight, is this idea that CRT, this is Keeanga's edited volume, Our History Has Always Been Contraband, and it's about the history of African American studies. One of the themes is that this concept of CRT has been decoded, distorted, and then recoded by the right. And so now the people don't even really understand what it is about. So if you could take the 45 seconds to say, what exactly is CRT and how it's been recoded and in the line with patriotic education. That was about 7 questions. So answer which one you see, whichever one you want.
So yeah, I taught a class last spring with a colleague called This is Critical Race Theory, basically to respond to all of the kind of innuendo and accusation of what critical race theory is. And the first thing you realize is the absurdity that critical race theory is being taught in kindergarten, 5th grade, or even in high school. These were concepts that were difficult for college students to kind of fully comprehend. And so critical race theory is a complicated set of ideas that originated with law students and legal scholars to try to understand how racism could continue to be perpetuated even when its legal framework was not in place. So in some ways, it's a question I take up in my book, Race for Profit, which is, why is there still housing discrimination after the Fair Housing Act is passed? The critical race theorists are asking, why is there still racial discrimination after the Civil Rights Revolution in the 1960s, which changes all of the laws and makes discrimination illegal? And so they point to the ways that you can have formal equality, but without kind of strict enforcement of the new laws, that it is still allowed to flourish, that there are ways in which racial discrimination is reinforced through cultural assumptions and not just the law. So it's a very tangled set of ideas that I think what the right's kind of quick and easy explanation was to say that, oh, these people just hate America and think that America is intrinsically evil and horrible, and that is why we should, be opposed to this critical race theory that is being taught from kindergarten up through college. So there's that kind of demonization, but I think a couple of things become clear with the patriotic education is that it's not that the right is opposed to politics in education. they just want their own kind of political vision at the center of that. And that becomes apparent when you look at the materials that they offer as the truth of what American history is. So, in this class on what is critical race theory, one of the first things we read after we read the US Constitution, which I can tell you most students in the class had never actually read. So, we start the class in reading the US Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, and then we read the Trump Commission, the 1776 Commission, which I think is maybe I can't remember how long it is, but it kind of gives you it summarizes a history of the United States from the founding up to the 1960s. And to me, one of the most interesting parts of it is what happens when you get to the Civil War. So historian Eric Foner has talked about the post-Civil War period as the second founding of the United States. And what he is referring to are the Reconstruction Amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment that actually write Black citizenship into the Constitution, into the kind of legal doctrines of the United States, where they are clearly sort of obliquely referred to prior to that. In the Constitution, it infamously does not mention slavery, Black people, or white people, but refers obliquely to the enslaved as other persons. And so when you look at the 1776 Commission, there is a mention of the 13th Amendment because it's somewhat unavoidable. There is no mention of the 14th Amendment. There is a bleak reference to, or a passing reference to the 15th Amendment, and the word Reconstruction is only used as an adjective, but not as a period of political contestation over what the future of the United States would be. And so that is a version of history that one can teach, but to say that that is the true version removed of any political inference is just a lie. And so it's all politics. All history is politics. There's a question of which politics you choose to emphasize, which politics you choose to reference. But the idea that there is some kind of that there's some sort of history that exists in the universe that has no connection to politics is illusory. And that is part of the kind of delusion that is being promoted here.
No, and one of the things I took from your book, or this edited volume, I should say, is that what is the kind of democratic way of thinking about history? There's this beautiful essay in your book by Marlon Williams Clark, which I would recommend. It's called "History is a Beautiful, Ugly Story, and We Must Teach It." And if I'm remembering correctly, I think Marlon is a high school teacher, and there's a line in the essay: "Some misinterpret the criticism as hate for America, but it is the opposite. Having different perspectives and viewpoints of history allows us to learn how to be better people, and critiquing one's country based on lived experiences is not hate, but a love so strong that one dares criticize this country to make it better, a more perfect union as stated in the preamble of the Constitution." And so this debate and this discussion today has me kind of thinking about what does it mean to have a democratic approach to history versus an authoritarian approach. And in patriotic education, certainly in the country I study, China, a patriotic education is basically a way of saying there is one version of history that everybody must know and agree to. And it's a narrative that fits the regime. It's a narrative that depicts certain people as heroes and certain people as villains, and it's not able to be contested. And right. Certain events are just erased completely and sanitized. And so I think one of the themes of this book that I really appreciated is that history is messy, it's ugly, it's beautiful at the same time, and it should be debated and contested, and that's part of it. And that contestation, that criticism is not anti-American. It's in fact the most American thing. It's patriotic in its own way. And so I appreciate that. I've gone on too long. I promised to leave room for
I've
Q&A.
gone on too long.
Well, I basically said race, Keeanga, go for four, and gave you 30 minutes. So that's my fault. And I also wanted to talk about the pro-democracy movement, if we can, really quickly. There's this question here about how do you build cross-racial working class solidarity at a time like this? So one of the kind of sad aspects of the Trump administration is they're feeding people kind of hate politics and not addressing fundamental economic grievances, that at the same time they're pulling out the welfare state and redistributing money upward. And so how do you acknowledge that poverty hits people differently, depending on white poverty looks different than black poverty, but there is a unifying issue here in the economic system. So how do you acknowledge those differences while building a cross-racial solidarity? And if the ultimate goal is kind of a more stable multiracial democracy, that is a question you can't answer in 2 minutes, but I'm going to give you only 2 minutes to do so. Take a stab at it.
Well, I would say that we have some powerful models to look at. I think that Sanders' campaign in 2016 and 2020, which ultimately failed, and that's a whole different story about the political maneuvering and machinations of the Democratic Party. But aside from the kind of characterization of Sanders as the Bernie Bros, that these ideas were only appealing to mostly white men, young black voters voted overwhelmingly in the primary for Sanders. I think that we've seen with Zohran Mamdani in New York City that the way that you can build a multiracial coalition is by looking at policies that can lift the vast majority of people. I think that, and again, Mamdani, there was a lot of emphasis on how Andrew Cuomo, the former disgraced governor of New York, won more black voters than Mamdani. Again, when you look at how young black voters, I think the age was up to 34, 18 to 34, voted. Mamdani won those voters is by looking at issues of affordability. I think there is a way in the 2020 protests kind of demonstrated this, of how you can look at issues of economic uplift that cut across the board, while also looking at particular policies that have detrimental impacts on Black and Latino people. I don't think that the issues of race can be avoided when you have an administration that is so intent on invoking race as a way to destroy that coalition. This is what the entire attack on immigrants is about. People say we have to pay the rent, we have to pay for groceries, and the Trump administration tells you that it's the fault of immigrants. So we have to be able to hold both. But I think that Mamdani most recently shows that there is a model that we can point to that puts economic uplift for the vast majority of people. How do we make the city more affordable at the center of its politics in an effective way?
Thank you for that. So we have only 3 minutes. I did want to ask your feelings. You're a student of social movements as well. And you gave an interview, I think it was to Democracy Now! Last fall, where you were talking a little bit about the state of social movements. And you had a quote where you were saying, you can't just turn them on and off like a faucet. It's not something you turn on when you need it and you turn off when you don't. I think that was last fall, prior to Trump coming into office, if I'm remembering the timing of that interview. In the interim, we've seen a pretty robust pro-democracy movement, and it has its roots in previous social movements in the last 10 years. No King's Day, by some accounts, was the largest single-day protest in American history, or one of the largest, depending on the data you're using. So how would you assess the state of the pro-democracy movement There's an event today, in fact, right? There's the Good Trouble event that's happening all over
John
the
Lewis.
country. Yeah. So how would you assess the state of the movement? Does that give you optimism, or what do you think the movement needs to do differently?
I think it's definitely optimistic because it shows that people are want to fight, that people are still kind of opposing this. But I will say that um, even though these demonstrations feel like they have gotten progressively larger, from hands off in April to No Kings, which was even bigger than those mobilizations, it has also felt insufficient. I would say that the first Trump administration was defined by protests. There were more protests in Trump's 4 years of the presidency than any other time in American history. Over 65,000 demonstrations that took place. The last ones over the course of the summer of 2020, eventually forcing him out of office. And so a question to ask then is how 5 years later, after 26 million people took the streets to oppose racism and to oppose inequality, do we end up with Trump back in office and things even more open racism, more inequality than experienced in 4 generations? And so I would say that it's not just about incrementally increasing the size of demonstrations until we hit some magical number where an authoritarian regime is then responsive, but that there is a question about the politics of the movement itself. And I would say that there is a question about the meaning of democracy, because I think that in January and February, when there were these kind of knee-jerk responses, and I don't mean that in a pejorative way, I mean like an instantaneous response to Trump's attacks on government agencies and laying off people. If your experience of a government agency or institution has been one of unresponsiveness, has been one that makes you feel oppressed, then there is a way in which Trump's actions could be read as a positive thing. I think that when we are in a situation where 85% of the American population believe that the federal government does not act on their behalf, where the Congress is seen with such little regard, where only 27% of people express any confidence in the Supreme Court, where equally small numbers of people express confidence in any of the governing institutions in the country, that there is a crisis of democracy, and movements that just purport to go back to where things were at before, that can seem as if they are defending the status quo against Trump, politically will have a problem. And so I think that it means that we actually have to have a kind of robust discussion, debate about what is meant by democracy. And I think one of the things that the Mamdani campaign has done is to link economic security to democracy, that we can't actually proclaim to have a just and democratic society when you have most of the country's wealth concentrated in the very top, while the rest of society is trying to figure out how to make the ends meet. And so I think that we have had a very kind of stultified understanding of democracy as this kind of banal defense of voting rights without questioning the political parties and the political candidates that we have to vote for. It's like voting rights, but to vote for the corrupt or the inept. And so this is an opportunity to open up the space of what democracy actually means and how we envision a different kind of society in the United States, so that this is not just about a retreat to what existed before, which is actually how we got here. So I think that the mobilizations are an important step, but it's an incomplete step. It has to be accompanied by politics. It's not just about more and more and more people on the streets. What are the ideas animating this? What are the politics of this movement?
Thank you for that. I think that's a good place to end, and also gives me an opportunity to highlight that we have Erica Chenoweth joining us in a few weeks as well. Erica is known for thinking about effective opposition, and is famous for this idea of this 3.5% threshold, which I think one thing that we'll hopefully get to talk about is under what conditions, what is the mechanism here? Just getting more people in the streets, more signs out there. How does that actually translate to political change? Right. And that's the big question. So we will leave it there. Thank you, Keeanga, for joining us today. Thank you all for coming. If you enjoyed this event, please come to our next one. Next week, we have Mark Beisinger, who's a colleague of mine in the politics department. Mark is one of the leading scholars on Russia, and is going to talk all things Putin and U.S.-Russia relations, the war in Ukraine as well. So thank you all for coming. Hope to see you next Thursday. Thank you.